Should you train to failure every set? Let's talk about it.
Don't you want to look good naked?
When it comes to training to failure, I do think that it's important to train to failure at certain points, but we don't want to do it all the time. So when we're training to build muscle specifically, we need to make sure that we're getting within our effective rep range to stimulate those muscle fibers. So effective reps just means those last few reps before you hit failure. So if you're not getting within that effective rep range, then you're not going to be getting the most out of your training to stimulate that muscle growth. So I do think it's important that you are going to failure at certain points, but we also want to make sure that we're paying attention to what exercises we're going to failure on, because some exercises cannot be as safe versus others that might be safer to take to failure. So a barbell back squat, for example, compared to a bicep curl. With that barbell back squat, might not be the best one to take to failure unless you are training for a 1 rep max, for example, or something like that. But typically within training for muscle growth, that might not be the case. So thinking about making sure that you're not training to failure on movements that could cause injury. But for other exercises like a bicep curl or a lateral raise, those ones are going to be much safer to take to failure. So I would say you could do those more often and pay attention to, again, those effective reps. So task failure happens when other things are failing before the target muscle tissue. So maybe your coordination starts to get all wonky, or you lose balance, or your cardiovascular system starts to be that limiting factor. We don't want that to happen when the goal is to build muscle, because we want the muscle to fail first. We want that target muscle tissue to be the thing that fails first. So think about if you are someone who's implementing squats in your training, a barbell back squat, for example, that might be a great movement, but if you find that your lower back is giving out or your cardiovascular system is giving out before you hit fatigue with, for example, your quads, then maybe that's not the best movement for you. And maybe you want to pick a movement that has a little bit more external stability. So maybe a hack squat, for example, or a split squat variation, where you can really bring your quads to its failure versus the other things taking over. So other muscles taking over or other things being the limiting factor. So when we're training for hypertrophy, I like to use something called an RIR or an RPE scale. So this is basically just telling you how many reps you have left in the tank. So RIR is reps in reserve. RPE is kind of the inverse scale, and it's your rate of perceived exertion. So with RIR, that's telling us where that effective rep range is. However, if we're using RIR in our training, so for example, if you are following a program and it says get to 2 reps in reserve or get to 1 rep in reserve, the only way that you're gonna know how many reps you have in reserve or how many reps you have left in the tank is if you take the movement you're doing to failure at some point. So something to think about, if you never take any movements to failure, how are you gonna know what your true RIR scale is? We know from the research actually that a lot of people underestimate their RIR scale. We've seen research multiple times that shows that people think that they're at a 1 RIR, but then they keep going and they end up getting like 3 or 4 or 5 more reps before they actually hit failure. Again, you need to pick and choose the ones that you know are gonna be safe for you, but taking some movements to failure is important to be able to gauge that RIR scale. How often should you go to failure? It's going to depend on, again, the movement that you're going to failure with, and also your overall training plan and your overall training program. So when I'm mentioning the movement, if we were to take, for example, an RDL or a hack squat to failure, that's gonna cause a lot of fatigue within our central nervous system, right? Because it's a very taxing movement. You're using a lot of muscle groups. So with that type of movement, we don't necessarily want to take that to failure all the time or very frequently. Versus another movement, which is maybe a smaller muscle group like a lateral raise or a tricep extension or a bicep curl, those you can probably take to failure more often because it's going to be a smaller muscle group. There's not much kind of central fatigue involved there. So those are gonna be a little bit safer to take to failure more often. So in general, you don't necessarily want to train to failure all the time or on all of your movements, but you probably should be training to failure at some points and picking movements that are safe for that to make sure that you're getting within that effective rep range so that you can build as much muscle as possible. believe